Picture a German sergeant of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, east of Bastogne, Belgium, on the morning of December 21st, 1944. He is crouched in a shell scrape, barely deep enough to call a foxhole, his coat stiff with ice, and his boots long past warm. Around him, a handful of men are doing what soldiers do in the quiet hours before dawn. One is eating cold rations. Another is writing a letter he may never send. Two more are sleeping, sitting up, heads against their packs. Nothing is coming. The fog is thick. The front has been quiet for an hour. The sergeant allows himself to believe, just for a moment, that the morning might be uneventful. Then the world ends. Not gradually, not with a ranging shot, not with the slow walk of a rolling barrage announcing itself over a minute or two. All of it arrives at once. Hundreds of shells, fired from dozens of guns scattered across 15 miles of Belgian countryside, land inside a space the size of a city block in a window of less than 3 seconds. There is no whistling warning. There is no build-up. One moment there is silence, and the next moment the frozen earth is a continuous explosion. He survives, barely. 2 of his men do not. This experience, described again and again in German prisoner interrogations across the Western Front, always ends the same way. When American soldiers bring captured German troops to divisional interrogation points, the prisoners ask, through translators, to see the machine. The automatic gun. The one that fires hundreds of shells in a single breath. They are certain it must exist, because no human crew, no battery of separate howitzers, could have done what they just endured. The Americans tell them there is no machine. What hit them was called time on target. And by the winter of 1944, it was the single most feared capability in the American arsenal among the officers of the Wehrmacht. More feared, in prisoner account after prisoner account, than the Sherman tank, more feared than the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber, more feared than anything else the Allies brought to the field. This is the story of how the United States Army built that weapon, not a gun, but a system. And why German colonels, hardened men who had fought from Poland to the Volga, recorded in their own after-action reports that American artillery was simply a thing of dread. To understand what made time on target so devastating, you have to understand the problem it solved. By the end of the First World War, artillery had proven itself the great killer of the modern battlefield. Post-war casualty studies by every major army reached the same conclusion. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of all battlefield deaths came from shellfire, not bullets, not bayonets, not gas. Guns had dominated the war, but the way armies used those guns was brutally inefficient. The standard technique was the rolling barrage, a wall of explosions that crept forward at a planned rate, maybe 100 yards every few minutes, with the infantry moving behind it. It worked, in a grinding way. It also gave defenders ample warning. Men could hear a rolling barrage coming from miles away. They could duck into their deepest holes, wait it out, and come back up with their machine guns ready before the infantry arrived. Here was the deeper problem. Every serious study of artillery effectiveness confirmed the same uncomfortable truth. Shellfire is most lethal in its very first seconds. The first rounds catch men upright, in the open, moving. Within a few seconds of the first impact, every survivor goes prone, scrambles for cover, and gets into a hole. Studies conducted by the Army after the war estimated that the lethality of continued shellfire dropped by roughly 2/3 once men were under cover. The first volley did most of the killing. Every shell after that did proportionally less. The logical solution was obvious. Deliver everything at once. Put every available shell on the target in the same instant, before a single man has time to react. Do not warn the enemy. Do not let him hear anything coming. Simply make the whole target area lethal in one breath. The problem was that this was nearly impossible to do. A 105mm howitzer shell fired from 3 miles away travels for about 20 seconds before it lands. A 155mm shell fired from 7 miles away might be in the air for 45 seconds. A 240mm super heavy shell can fly for more than a minute. Coordinate a dozen batteries scattered across 10 miles of countryside, each at a different range and elevation, each firing different calibers, each with its own ammunition batch and powder temperature, and get all of their shells to land on the same patch of ground inside a 3-second window. Before about 1941, no field army in the world could do that routinely. The Americans solved it, and they did it before the war started, at a dusty post in southwest Oklahoma called Fort Sill. Fort Sill was, and remains, the home of the United States Army Field Artillery School. In the 1920s and 1930s, it was a backwater. The army was tiny. Money was almost non-existent. Most of the field pieces were French 75mm guns left over from 1918, still being hauled by horses in some units. But inside the gunnery department of the school, a small group of officers was quietly rewriting the science of indirect fire. The central figure was a lieutenant colonel named Leslie James McNair. McNair was an artilleryman, a precise and professorial officer who had served as a brigadier general in France in 1918, and who would, by 1942, command Army Ground Forces, the organization responsible for training every American soldier who fought in Europe. McNair was obsessed with two things: streamlining military organizations and centralizing artillery fire control. Around him at Fort Sill gathered a group of officers who would all become generals in the next war. Carlos Brewer ran the gunnery department in the early 1930s. Jacob Devers, later commander of the 6th Army Group in France, succeeded him. Orlando Ward, later commander of the 1st Armored Division in North Africa, followed Devers. In the spring of 1931, Brewer's team demonstrated something that had never been routinely done before in any army. They masked the fires of an entire artillery battalion, 3 batteries firing simultaneously, on a single target by means of a centralized firing chart. The chart was a paper map at a fixed scale, with every gun position carefully surveyed and plotted. A single small group of officers and enlisted calculators at battalion level, rather than each gun crew computing its own data, would take a call for fire from a forward observer, plot the target on the chart, calculate the precise firing data for every gun in the battalion, and send each gun its individual elevation, deflection, and fuse setting. This was the founding moment of what became the American Fire Direction Center, or the FDC. The leap to time on target followed directly. Once the FDC could compute firing data for any battery in range, it could also compute the time of flight for each gun's shells. If you wanted every shell to land at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, you told each battery the target time and its computed time of flight. A battery 3 miles away with a 20-second flight fires at 5:59 and 40 seconds. A battery 7 miles away with a 45-second flight fires at 5:59 and 15 seconds. A heavy gun 10 miles back with a 60-second flight fires at 5:59 exactly. If the math was right, and if every battery's watches were synchronized, every shell from every gun for 15 miles around arrived within 3 seconds of each other. 3 battalions firing from 3 different directions would seem, to the enemy on the receiving end, to have fired one single, impossibly enormous salvo. By the spring of 1942, this technique was being taught as standard doctrine at Fort Sill. The British had independently developed a similar procedure in North Africa during late 1941, using BBC radio time signals to synchronize officers' watches across the desert. They called it time on target. The Americans adopted the name. But where the British used it as a specialized technique reserved for set-piece occasions, the Americans built it into the daily routine of every field artillery unit. American gunners could call a time-on-target mission in the middle of a meeting engagement, on a target spotted 10 minutes earlier, with no rehearsal. McNair had also done something else that would prove equally important. He had a passion for organizational efficiency that he called defatting. Before the war, United States field artillery had been organized into rigid regiments and brigades tied permanently to specific divisions. McNair restructured that in December 1942. Non-divisional artillery would be parceled into separate self-contained battalions that could be attached to any corps or army as the situation demanded. A lightweight headquarters called a field artillery group could control 3 or 4 such battalions. A brigade headquarters could control 3 or 4 groups. What this meant in practice was that a corps commander in France could mass 12, 20, even 30 separate artillery battalions on a single target almost as quickly as he could pick up a telephone. No other army in the war had this organizational flexibility. German artillery stayed organic to individual divisions and rarely achieved cross-divisional concentrations. Soviet artillery built enormous centralized breakthrough formations for set-piece offensives, but was not nimble enough to improvise rapid concentrations on targets of opportunity. The Americans could. And they did, constantly. By the time American troops landed in North Africa in November 1942, the army was fielding a complete and modern family of artillery pieces built around this doctrine. The workhorse was the M2A1 105mm howitzer. Every infantry division had 3 battalions of 12 of these, one battalion habitually supporting each of the division's 3 infantry regiments. A single battery of 4 guns, well served, could put nearly a ton of high explosive on a target every 60 seconds. The M2A1 could throw its 33-pound shell to a maximum range of roughly 11,000 meters, about 7 miles, at a sustained rate of 3 rounds per minute. Above the divisional 105s sat the M155mm howitzer and the long-barreled 155mm long tom cannon, which could throw a 95-pound shell more than 14 miles. Long toms were corps-level assets, organized into separate battalions. Heavier still were the 8-inch howitzers and the 240mm howitzers, called the Black Dragons, which sent a 360-pound shell across an enormous distance. For mobility with armored units, the United States Army built the M7 Priest, a 105mm howitzer mounted on a medium tank chassis, allowing armored divisions to keep their artillery moving alongside the tanks. But none of these guns meant anything without the 3-legged system that tied them together. The first leg was the forward observer, usually a lieutenant from the field artillery assigned to an infantry or tank company, carrying a radio and binoculars, moving with the rifle platoons. American forward observers had the authority to call in fire from any artillery battalion within range. Fort Sill had also pioneered the use of light Piper L4 spotter aircraft, called grasshoppers, flown by artillery officers to direct fire from above. The second leg was the FDC itself, a half-track or a tent crowded with map boards, range tables, graphical firing tables, and 3 or 4 enlisted calculators who could compute firing data faster than most people today could manage with a calculator. Veterans who served in fire direction centers remember running simultaneous missions for multiple targets, calculating, plotting, and broadcasting fire commands through entire nights. The third leg was communications. Every battery had wire to its FDC. Every FDC had wire and radios up to higher headquarters. Every forward observer carried a backpack radio with a clear channel to his battalion. The Americans gave artillery the highest priority on the communications network. The standard call for fire on a worthwhile target was simple. Fire mission battalion. All 12 guns. If the target was bigger, the forward observer stepped it up. Fire mission division. 36 guns, all 3 divisional battalions at once. Or the most fearsome call of all, fire mission corps. Every gun within range, all aimed at the same point, all timed to arrive in the same 3-second window. The first time the German army encountered this system in anything like its full form was in Tunisia in the spring of 1943. The opening rounds were not promising. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass, between February 19th and 24th, 1943, the Afrika Corps, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, struck the Green United States Second Corps and threw it backward more than 50 miles. American positions were overrun. Entire batteries were captured. The Wehrmacht came away from Kasserine largely convinced that American soldiers were soft and poorly led. But inside the Kasserine story was the first hint of what was coming. As Rommel's 10th Panzer Division drove beyond the pass toward the village of Thala, threatening to break into the Allied rear, Brigadier General Samuel Leroy Irwin, the 9th Infantry Division artillery commander, was ordered to race forward without his infantry. Irwin's gunners made a forced march of roughly 735 miles through Algeria and Tunisia, arriving at Thala on the night of February 21st, 1943. By the morning of the 22nd, his combined American and British guns, including long-range 155mm howitzers, whose heavy, distinctive blast carried across the desert, were laying down massed fire on the leading German tanks. The commander of the 10th Panzer Division, General Major Friedrich von Broich, a rank equivalent to a United States Brigadier General, recognized from the sound that he was now facing 155mm weapons. His scouts reported fresh American troops had moved up overnight. Assuming an entire new American division had arrived, von Broich recommended withdrawal. Rommel agreed. The Kasserine offensive ended that day. A single artillery brigade, without its infantry, had reversed a German breakthrough. 3 weeks later, on the morning of March 23, 1943, the 10th Panzer Division launched its major armoured counterattack at the Battle of El Guettar, driving directly into the prepared positions of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, under Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen. German armour came on in the morning fog. American forward observers on the high ground above the valley directed concentrated artillery into the kill zone. By the end of the day, the German armoured attack was broken. This was the first clean American victory over German armour in the war. In post-battle assessments, German staff officers noted, for the first time in official reports, the effectiveness of American artillery control and the speed with which American fire could be concentrated. Italy, in 1943 and 1944, deepened those lessons further. At Anzio, in January and February 1944, the German counter-offensive against the American 6th Corps beachhead was repeatedly disrupted by massed artillery firing from the constricted perimeter. General Eberhard von Mackensen, commanding the German 14th Army, later described what his troops faced as the heaviest artillery fire his forces had ever encountered. His attacks across the open ground around the beachhead stalled in mud and craters. The American gunners at Anzio were firing from a perimeter only a few miles deep, yet they massed enough fires to stop division-sized German assaults cold. The lesson was the same one learned at Thala and El Guettar. When the American fire direction system had good targets in the open, it was nearly impossible to press an attack against it to a successful conclusion. By the time the Americans landed in France in June 1944, the artillery arm had 18 months of hard combat experience behind it. In the hedgerow country of Normandy that summer, American artillery and infantry teams developed a punishing rhythm. Official records show that during the fighting for Hill 192 outside Saint-Lô in July 1944, the 2nd Infantry Division alone fired up to 20 time-on-target missions in a single night to keep German defenders off balance. 20 times in a single darkness, with no warning, the world around men in those positions simply detonated. The greatest single concentration of American artillery fire in the Western European campaign came on July 25, 1944, with the opening of Operation Cobra, General Omar Bradley's breakout from the Normandy beachhead. Cobra is remembered chiefly for the air bombardment that preceded it. Approximately 1,500 heavy bombers dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on a front, roughly 7 miles wide, with hundreds of medium bombers and fighter bombers adding nearly another 1,000 tons. But the air attack was only the opening act. When the bombers finished, the 7 and 8 Corps Assault Force, fielding more than 500 guns between them, fired a total of approximately 170,000 rounds allocated to the operation. The Panzer Lehr Division, the elite German armoured formation holding the line south of Saint-Lô, was not so much defeated as obliterated. Survivors told interrogators they had never experienced anything like it. Officers wandered the wreckage of their command posts, unable to remember their own names. General Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded Panzer Lehr and had served under Rommel in the desert and fought on the Eastern Front, said in his post-war interrogation that his position looked like the surface of the moon, and that at least 70% of his troops were dead, wounded, dazed, or incapable of action. Cobra also claimed the life of the man who had built the system. Lieutenant General Leslie James McNair, the architect of American artillery doctrine, came to France in part to serve as a decoy commander for the fictional 1st United States Army Group, a deception operation designed to keep German forces pinned at the Pas de Calais. On July 25, 1944, he was in a slit trench on the forward positions of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, observing the operation when a short bomb from an American aircraft landed almost directly on his position. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in action in the European theatre of the war. The doctrine he had built kept killing Germans for 10 more months. 2 weeks after Cobra, at a rocky hill east of the French town of Mortain, Time on Target produced one of its most dramatic single achievements. On August 7, 1944, Hitler ordered Operation Lüttich, a desperate panzer counterattack designed to cut off Patton's Third Army by reaching the coast at Avranches. 4 German panzer divisions drove westward in the dark, deliberately without artillery preparation to preserve surprise. They tore into the American 30th Infantry Division, and quickly surrounded the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment on the summit of Hill 314 east of Mortain. What the Germans did not know was that several forward observer teams were also on Hill 314, with working radios and a commanding view for miles in every direction. For 5 days, while roughly 700 surrounded Americans beat off attacks by the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, 2 observers from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, 1st Lieutenant Charles Bartz and 2nd Lieutenant Robert Weiss, along with an additional observer team from the 120th Infantry's Cannon Company, held a special priority on 7th Corps heavy artillery. From their hilltop positions, they called down time-on-target salvos onto German armoured columns moving on the roads below. Battalion after battalion of American guns broke up the German attacks, column by column, road by road. Operation Lüttich collapsed. The German armoured thrust that was supposed to change the outcome of the Normandy campaign was shattered, in large part, by a handful of lieutenants with radios on a hill. The resourcefulness shown during the siege went beyond calling fire. With the besieged battalion running critically short of medical supplies, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Wieman, commanding the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, together with his staff devised an emergency measure. They opened smoke shell casings, removed the smoke canisters, repacked the shells with bandages, dressings, and sulfanilamide, and fired them up onto the hilltop. The plasma bottles shattered on impact and were lost. Some bandages and dressings survived and were recovered. It was an improvisation born of desperation, and while its practical value was limited, it stood as a measure of what American artillerists were willing to attempt for the men they were supporting. Now, what did the Germans actually think about all of this? The answer is preserved in hundreds of prisoner interrogation reports, post-war manuscripts written by captured German officers for the United States Army Historical Division, and in the private correspondence of senior Wehrmacht commanders. And the answer is remarkably consistent. Almost every captured German officer, when asked about the American army, gave a version of the same response. American infantry, variable. American armor, numerous, but not always decisive. American air power, devastating when the weather cleared. But the artillery, always the artillery, was singled out in report after report as the most dangerous, most demoralizing, most technically impressive element on the battlefield. The image that appears again and again in these accounts is the same. German prisoners, including hardened veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front, asking their American captors to show them the automatic gun. The impossible machine that fired hundreds of shells in a single breath. They could not accept that the weapon they had faced was operated by human hands. The concept of dozens of separate gun crews, scattered across miles of countryside, each firing at a slightly different moment, producing simultaneous impacts on a single target, simply did not compute for men trained on German artillery doctrine. In their own language, German soldiers reached for the most extreme weather metaphors available. They called time-on-target preparations a Stahlgewitter, a steel thunderstorm. They spoke of a Feuerhagel, a hailstorm of fire. These were not idle literary flourishes. These were the only frameworks available to men trying to describe something that felt less like enemy action and more like a natural catastrophe. Generalleutnant Hans Schmidt, commander of the German 275th Infantry Division in the Hurtgen Forest fighting of late 1944, wrote extensively in his post-war accounts about the psychological experience of being under American artillery. He described the combination of shell bursts in the treetops, which rained both steel fragments and heavy wood splinters downward onto anyone beneath the canopy, and the sheer speed of concentration, as producing a special kind of paralysis in his men. The forest itself became an amplifier. Every impact sounded larger than it was. Every shattered branch became a secondary projectile. Men who survived multiple American artillery preparations in the Hurtgen described to their officers an experience that went beyond ordinary fear into something else entirely. Schmidt's division was reduced to a few hundred effective men after weeks of American artillery fire and infantry attacks. What destroyed his unit was not one dramatic battle. It was the cumulative, relentless weight of massed fire that broke individual soldiers' ability to function. The pattern repeated across the Western Front. Allied psychiatric studies conducted after the war estimated that roughly a quarter of all German psychiatric casualties in the West were directly attributable to prolonged exposure to Allied shellfire. German divisional morale reports from the autumn of 1944 began noting, with increasing alarm, that artillery exposure was thinning their ranks as effectively as direct casualties. Desertion, which had been almost unknown in the Wehrmacht in 1940 and 1941, became chronic in the West after the summer of 1944. It is worth being honest about the German side of this equation, because the Wehrmacht was not weak in artillery by any absolute measure. German howitzers, like the 10.5 cm light field howitzer 18 and the 15 cm heavy field howitzer 18, were first-rate weapons. German gunners were professionally trained. What the Germans lacked was not competent guns or competent men. What they lacked was the American system. German artillery battalions remained permanently assigned to their parent divisions. Cross-divisional concentrations required coordination through corps and army headquarters that could take hours to arrange. German radio equipment, while often excellent in quality, was far less abundant than American sets. A German infantry battalion might share a single radio with adjacent companies. An American artillery forward observer carried his own set with a direct channel back to his battalion fire direction center. Above all, German ammunition supply collapsed under Allied air attack and the grinding demands of a two-front war. By late 1944, many German artillery batteries on the Western Front were rationed to as few as 10 to 15 rounds per gun per day, and that figure was falling. American batteries routinely had 200, 300, even 500 rounds available per gun per day. You cannot execute time on target when you do not have shells to fire. The German defensive response became increasingly desperate. Trenches were dug deeper. Overhead log and earth cover became standard in forested terrain to defeat tree bursts. Reverse slope positions became the default defensive layout. German batteries learned to displace immediately after firing to avoid being located by American sound-ranging teams and silenced by counter-battery fire. Many German batteries stopped firing during daylight entirely. None of these adaptations were enough. They slowed the killing. They did not stop it. The Battle of the Bulge, which began on December 16, 1944, became the largest and most complete demonstration of what American artillery could do under extreme pressure. The German offensive through the Ardennes surprised the thinly held American front of the 8th Corps. The 106th Infantry Division lost most of 2 regiments encircled near Schonberg. The 28th Infantry Division was scattered across miles of forest roads. Gun batteries up and down the Ardennes had to displace under fire or be overrun. For the first 2 days, German armor moved with a freedom it had not enjoyed since Normandy. But once American artillery established new positions behind the developing Bulge, the picture changed entirely. Nowhere was this more visible than at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division, under the acting command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, held the critical road junction. Major General Maxwell Taylor, the division's commander, was in Washington at the time. The assistant division commander was in England. McAuliffe, as the division's artillery commander and the senior officer present, stepped into command. He was facing elements of as many as 5 German divisions pressing against the Bastogne perimeter. He understood exactly what his guns could do. Inside the perimeter, McAuliffe had 7 artillery battalions under his central control: the 321st Glider Field Artillery, the 907th Glider Field Artillery, the 377th Parachute Field Artillery, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery, under Lieutenant Colonel John T. Cooper, the 420th Armored Field Artillery, attached from Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 755th Field Artillery Battalion, and the 969th Field Artillery Battalion. The Germans never coordinated their attacks against Bastogne simultaneously. They struck sector by sector, division by division, each assault separated by hours or days. McAuliffe's centrally controlled artillery shifted fires from one threatened point to another, throwing time-on-target salvos onto each German attack as it materialized, defeating each one before the next began. When the German commander sent a formal surrender demand on December 22, 1944, McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," was the answer of a man who knew his guns were still working. The Bulge also saw the first ground anti-personnel use of a technology that transformed time on target from a devastating weapon into something close to absolute in open terrain. The variable time fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter that bounced a signal off the ground and detonated the shell at a preset altitude above the target, typically between 20 and 30 feet. Until December 1944, the fuse had been used only in anti-aircraft roles. The fear was that an unexploded round, recovered by German engineers, could be reverse-engineered. The severity of the German offensive changed that calculation. The first ground anti-personnel use came on December 16, 1944, at Monschau, ordered by Colonel George Axelson, commanding the 406th Artillery Group. By December 21st, Eisenhower had formally cleared all restrictions on ground use. The effect was profound. A shell detonating 30 feet in the air created a lethal zone with no protection from a standard foxhole unless the position had overhead cover. Combined with time-on-target delivery, a single American battalion firing these fuses could turn a German company in the open into a casualty report in seconds. German combat reports from the Bulge begin noting, from late December onward, shells that exploded in the air without striking anything. The reports describe men who had done everything right, who were in their positions, who were behind cover, dying anyway, because the cover only protected them from shells landing in the ground. Before the Rhine, before the final drives into the German heartland, there was the Hurtgen Forest. And the Hurtgen Forest is where any honest account of American artillery has to pause and acknowledge the limits of even the best system in the world. The Hurtgen was a 50-square-mile stretch of dense fir forest east of the German city of Aachen. The battle fought there between September 1944 and February 1945 stands as one of the longest in United States Army history and the longest fought on German soil during the war. 8 American infantry divisions, 2 armored divisions, and many attached units rotated through that forest. Nearly 30,000 American casualties were sustained, not counting the replacements who arrived, fought briefly, and became casualties in turn. The 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division, fighting in the Hurtgen in November and December 1944, had 9 artillery battalions in direct support. It still sustained 2,773 casualties in 18 days of action. The forest stripped away most of the American advantages. The dense canopy meant that shells burst in the treetops rather than in the ground, raining steel fragments and wood splinters downward. German defenders in deep log-covered bunkers were largely protected. American infantry attacking through the trees was not. Fog and low cloud cancelled air observation on most days. Narrow fire breaks restricted tank movement to predictable lanes that German anti-tank crews had already zeroed. Even so, artillery remained the difference between holding and being overrun. On December 7, 1944, the 2nd Ranger Battalion seized Hill 400, called Bergberg by the Germans, deep in the Hurtgen. The hill dominated the surrounding forest, and the Germans counterattacked it repeatedly. During the fighting, Lieutenant Howard Kettelhut of the 56th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, serving as the forward observer on the hilltop, directed fire from a reported 18 artillery battalions simultaneously, placing a concentrated ring of explosions around the perimeter that shattered a German assault before it reached the American positions. 18 battalions, coordinated in real time, from a single observer on a contested hilltop. The Hurtgen Forest was not a failure of American artillery. It was proof that artillery alone cannot solve every tactical problem terrain can create. It was also proof that even heavily constrained artillery remained the most important single factor on the field. As 1945 opened and Allied forces drove toward Germany itself, the scale of American artillery fire reached levels that beggar description. When the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine in late March 1945, the artillery effort assembled was the largest in American military history to that point. Operation Plunder, the main Allied crossing in the north, launched on the evening of March 23, 1945. Along the 22-mile assault frontage, the British 21st Army Group had assembled roughly 4,000 to 5,500 guns. Within that force, the American 9th Army's sector alone fired more than 65,000 rounds during the preparatory bombardment, peaking at thousands of rounds per minute. The German 1st Parachute Army, defending the eastern bank, simply disintegrated as a coherent force. Veterans of American artillery units described it afterward as the largest single concentration of simultaneous fire any of them had ever experienced or witnessed. Within a month, Germany surrendered. The senior American commanders of the war did not disagree among themselves about what had been decisive. General George Patton, in his published Memoirs, stated bluntly that artillery had largely won the war. He noted throughout the campaign that American willingness to expend ammunition, combined with the fire direction system built at Fort Sill, gave his armies an offensive capability of a kind no previous army had possessed at the same scale of responsiveness. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group from August 1944 onward, wrote after the war that artillery was the American Army's single greatest tactical advantage over the German Army in the European theatre. American commanders at every level, he observed, shared an institutional habit of letting the artillery fight the war as much as possible. It was not reluctance on the infantry's part. It was confidence in a system that, by 1944, could reach any target on the front within minutes and deliver more fire in 30 seconds than most German divisions could answer in a day. General Dwight Eisenhower, in his post-war assessments, consistently identified the field artillery as one of the most decisive components of American ground forces in Europe. From the German side, the assessments were no less clear. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy and later in the West, told American interrogators in 1945 that American artillery's combination of accuracy, weight, and responsiveness had been a constant strategic problem he could never solve. General Major Karl Thorholt, who served as a senior German artillery commander on the Western Front and submitted extensive post-war essays to the United States Army Historical Division, described the American Fire Direction Center system as the technical solution to the problem of massed fires, one that the Wehrmacht had understood in principle but had never operationally achieved. The hard numbers behind these judgments are stark. Post-war American medical studies attributed roughly 60 to 65% of all American battle casualties in the European theatre to artillery and mortar fire. Small arms fire, the weapon that dominates the popular imagination of infantry combat, accounted for perhaps 14 to 30% of battlefield deaths on both sides. Multiple surveys of German prisoner and casualty data pointed to a comparable pattern in reverse. The gun, not the rifle, was the great killer of the Second World War in Europe. Germany, even at the peak of its wartime production in 1944, was producing roughly 30 to 40 million artillery rounds per year, across all calibers, and that figure was falling steadily as Allied bombing reached deeper into German industry. The United States was producing more than 100 million rounds per year. The disparity in shells mirrored the disparity in outcomes. What made time on target different from every earlier attempt at massed fires was not the guns themselves. The guns were not unusual. What was unusual was the system built around them. Forward observers with radios moving with the infantry. Centralized fire direction centers computing simultaneous firing data for every gun in range. An organizational structure that could mass a dozen independent battalions on a single target in minutes. An ammunition supply chain built to feed that system at any scale the front demanded. And a fuse technology that, by December 1944, could detonate shells above the target with no need for direct ground impact. Take any one of those components away and you have competent artillery. Put all of them together, coordinated by doctrine developed in peacetime at Fort Sill and proven across 18 months of combat before the main European campaign began, and you have the weapon that broken panzer commanders and exhausted grenadiers tried to describe to their interrogators. They called it a machine. They called it automatic. They called it a Stahlgewitter, a steel thunderstorm. They kept asking to see the impossible gun. There was no impossible gun. There were young men from Ohio and Georgia and Kansas and Texas, crouched over mapboards and telephone handsets in tents and half-tracks, doing the arithmetic of destruction with pencils and printed range tables. There were other young men standing at gun trails in the mud and snow of France and Belgium and Germany, swinging breech handles and ramming shells home and yanking lanyards on command. There were lieutenants in ditches and on hilltops with binoculars and radio handsets, calling adjustments in the precise clipped language Fort Sill had trained into them. The men who built the system did not all survive to see its results. McNair died in a slit trench on the forward positions of the 30th Infantry Division on July 25, 1944, killed by his own side's bombs. Carlos Brewer, who had demonstrated battalion massing on a paper chart in Oklahoma in 1931, never became famous outside the artillery community. Orlando Ward was relieved of command in North Africa in 1943, despite being one of the architects of the doctrine that would later win the war. The lieutenants who called fire from hilltops and the sergeants who served the guns are not household names. But what they built together, in the quiet years before anyone was shooting and in the mud and snow of the years when the shooting would not stop, changed the outcome of the most destructive war in human history. Korea tested the doctrine 5 years after the Rhine crossing. When Chinese forces struck deep into United Nations lines in late 1950, American artillery responded with the same system. At the Battle of Chipyong-ni in February 1951, the 23rd Regimental Combat Team and its attached French battalion held their perimeter against elements of approximately 5 Chinese divisions attacking in waves at night. What stopped the assaults, night after night, was the same fire direction center procedure, the same forward observers, the same simultaneous impacts on the same assembly areas. Vietnam extended the doctrine further. Helicopter borne forward, observers replaced the dismounted officers of the Second World War. Computer-assisted fire direction centers replaced the slide rules and graphical firing tables. The fundamental concept, simultaneous impacts from all available guns on a single target, remained unchanged. Fire support bases across the Central Highlands and the Mekong Delta regularly produced massed time-on-target concentrations against enemy formations, sometimes within minutes of the initial contact report. Today, in the United States Army's current field manual for fire support and field artillery operations, the phrase time on target appears as a routine technical term, as unremarkable as any other standard procedure. Modern automated fire control systems compute time of flight to fractions of a second across dozens of firing platforms simultaneously. The doctrine that a small group of officers wrote at Fort Sill in the early 1930s is still the foundation of the way the American Army fights with its guns. The question the German prisoners kept asking was the wrong question. They wanted to know what gun. The answer was never the gun. It was always the system behind it. A system built not by a secret weapons program, not by a single genius inventor, but by a generation of artillery officers who spent the quiet years before the war solving a problem everyone else had given up on. They solved it in an Oklahoma classroom. They tested it in the desert at Kasserine and Guettar. They proved it in the hedgerows of Normandy, on the hilltops at Mortain, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and on the eastern bank of the Rhine. And the Wehrmacht, for all its skill and fighting tradition, never found an answer to a system that was already complete before the first shot of the war was fired. That is why they feared it, and that is why, more than 80 years later, it still matters.